spring of 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its final chapters, yet the violence was far from over. General George S. Patton's Third Army had been advancing at an almost unstoppable pace, sweeping through southern Germany, liberating towns and villages as the Nazi regime began to crumble. But in one city, resistance remained stubborn. Intelligence reports warned of heavily fortified positions, a German general determined to hold his ground, and civilians trapped in the crossfire. Patton's forces surrounded the city, cutting off supply lines and encircling the defenders. Messages were sent, demanding surrender, promising mercy if the German commander laid down his arms. The reply came, blunt and defiant. "Come and take it." Those 4 words carried the weight of a challenge, a statement of unwavering resolve that sent a chill through Patton's staff. It was rare to encounter such bold defiance at this stage of the war, and Patton knew that what lay ahead would test his strategy, his men, and the limits of urban combat. The city itself was a maze of narrow streets, ancient stone buildings, and fortified positions that had been reinforced with sandbags, barricades, and hidden machine gun nests. Every corner could hide a deadly sniper. Every alley could conceal a trap. Patton understood that a frontal assault could cost hundreds of American lives, yet he also knew that hesitation could embolden the defenders, prolong the suffering of civilians, and allow German reinforcements to slip in. Time was a critical factor, and the clock was ticking. Patton inspected maps with his officers, studying every street, square, and potential choke point. Reports from scouts revealed the city's defenses were organized, disciplined, and ruthless. Yet Patton remained confident. He had faced fierce resistance before and had a reputation for bold maneuvers that often caught his enemies off guard. He paced his tent, thinking about the thousands of lives hanging in balance, both the men under his command and the civilians trapped inside the city. As night fell, American soldiers positioned themselves around the outskirts, listening to the eerie silence, broken only by distant artillery. Fires from previous skirmishes lit the horizon, casting shadows over the city walls. The German defenders, aware of their encirclement, prepared for the inevitable clash. Morale was high on both sides. The Americans were fueled by the anticipation of a final victory, while the Germans were driven by a sense of desperate defiance, convinced that surrender was not an option. Patton, ever the strategist, knew this battle would not just be about military might, it would be a test of will, a clash of determination between 2 leaders, and a fight that could shape the final days of the war in Europe. He sent his officers out to make final preparations, arranging artillery positions, organizing infantry units, and coordinating with armor support. Every decision mattered, and every choice carried consequences. The city waited, silent yet alive with tension, unaware that its streets would soon be the stage for 6 days of brutal combat that would push both sides to their limits. The stage was set. The German general's defiance had drawn the line, and Patton was ready to cross it. In a matter of hours, silence would turn to the roar of battle, and the world would witness the deadly combination of strategy, courage, and relentless determination. The story of what happened next would become a testament to leadership, resolve, and the harrowing realities of war.
Patton knew that taking the city would require more than brute force. Urban warfare was unpredictable, deadly, and exhausting. Every street, every building could become a fortress. Civilians were trapped in basements and attics, their lives intertwined with the fate of the combatants. The challenge was clear. Advance too quickly, and American forces could be cut down by snipers and hidden explosives. Move too cautiously, and the German defenders could regroup or strengthen their barricades. There was no simple path forward. In the days leading up to the assault, Patton's officers meticulously studied the city's layout. Detailed maps showed narrow alleys, open squares, and the location of factories and municipal buildings that could be turned into strong points. Scouts had reported the presence of Panzerfausts and machine guns on upper floors, evidence that the German general had prepared his men for a fight to the last breath. Patton's strategy had to account for every possible threat. Artillery units were positioned on high ground around the city, ready to deliver precise barrages, but with caution. Heavy shelling could destroy key buildings, but it also risked killing civilians. Tanks were held in reserve, their armor a shield against machine gun fire, yet their maneuverability in narrow streets was limited. Infantry units were briefed on every street corner and every potential ambush. Each squad would move carefully, supported by suppressive fire and guided by scouts who had already mapped enemy positions. At the same time, psychological warfare played a role. Loudspeakers broadcast messages urging surrender, promising fair treatment if the German commander yielded. Yet each message was met with the same stubborn reply: "Come and take it." Patton understood that these words were more than defiance. They were a challenge to his authority, a test of his resolve. He was determined to answer it, but he also needed to preserve the lives of his men and maintain the momentum of the campaign. Behind the lines, soldiers prepared themselves mentally for what was coming. Urban combat demanded focus, courage, and adaptability. The Americans trained in mock urban settings, practicing clearing rooms, moving along streets, and securing buildings. Medics and support units were briefed and positioned, knowing that casualties could be high. Supply lines were secured, ammunition stockpiles checked, and communication networks established to maintain coordination across units. Patton himself inspected the troops, walking among them, observing their readiness. He spoke to officers about tactics, emphasizing the need for speed, coordination, and decisive action. His reputation for boldness inspired confidence, but he also acknowledged the risks. The city's defenses were formidable, and the German general's determination was evident. Every choice in the coming assault could tip the balance between victory and a costly stalemate. As dawn approached on the day of the assault, the city seemed almost quiet, deceptively calm under a pale morning light. The air was tense, thick with anticipation. Every soldier knew that when the first shots rang out, hours would stretch into days of relentless fighting. The streets would become battlefields, buildings would turn into fortresses, and both sides would be pushed to the limits of endurance. Patton's planning, the discipline of his troops, and the courage of individual soldiers would determine the outcome. The Germans waited behind barricades, confident that the city's labyrinthine streets would frustrate the Americans. But Patton had already seen such challenges before. He had faced determined resistance in France, Belgium, and across Germany. His approach combined careful planning with bold execution, a mixture of artillery, armor, and infantry coordination that often overwhelmed defenders. Yet he knew that no plan survived first contact with the enemy unscathed. Adaptation and resolve would be critical in the coming battle. By midday, the final preparations were complete. Scouts reported German patrols and sniper positions, artillery crews checked targeting coordinates, and tanks rumbled into position behind makeshift cover. The infantry stood ready, every soldier aware that the city's narrow streets would offer no mercy. Patton looked over the city one last time, his mind calculating, anticipating, and ready for action. The stage was set, the pieces in place. What followed would be 6 days of intense urban combat, each moment a test of strategy, skill, and courage under fire.
The assault began in the early hours, the first artillery shells shaking the city streets and signaling the start of a battle that would last 6 days. American infantry moved cautiously, supported by tanks that advanced behind debris-strewn streets. German defenders had fortified every corner, and snipers waited in upper floors to pick off anyone exposed. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to the echo of gunfire, praying the walls around them would hold. Each block became a miniature battlefield. Soldiers moved from building to building, clearing rooms with careful precision, aware that one wrong step could trigger hidden explosives. Tanks provided cover, their main guns blasting barricades and fortified doors, but in narrow streets, their power was limited. The Germans had anticipated every tactic, setting traps and creating choke points that slowed the American advance. The fighting was relentless. Hours stretched into days as units pressed forward under constant fire. Mortar rounds rained down, grenades exploded in alleyways, and machine guns sprayed deadly fire from windows and rooftops. Every advance cost lives, but each step brought the Americans closer to the heart of the city. Patton's leadership was evident, his officers coordinating attacks with precision, adjusting plans as the battle evolved. German counterattacks were fierce. Small squads launched sudden raids against exposed American positions, attempting to disrupt supply lines and communication. Each skirmish tested the discipline and resolve of Patton's troops. The defenders were determined, fighting for every building, every street corner, aware that surrender was not an option for their general. Amid the chaos, acts of heroism stood out. Soldiers risked their lives to rescue comrades pinned down by fire. Medics moved under relentless threat, carrying the wounded to safety. Infantry units adapted quickly, using clever tactics to outflank fortified positions. The Americans combined artillery, tank fire, and infantry maneuvers in a brutal dance that slowly eroded the German defenses. By the third day, the city was a shell of its former self. Fires consumed buildings, rubble blocked streets, and smoke hung thick over the urban landscape. Yet the German defenders held pockets of resistance, forcing house-to-house combat that demanded patience, courage, and relentless determination. Patton's strategy of pressure and precision began to take its toll, but he knew the battle could not be rushed. Every lost life mattered, and the city's destruction weighed heavily on him and his officers. Nightfall offered little respite. Snipers and machine guns continued their deadly work, and the sounds of distant artillery punctuated the darkness. Both sides were exhausted, yet the fighting would resume at dawn. The Americans had gained ground, but the cost was high, and the German general's defiance had not yet been broken. Each day of combat became a psychological battle as well, testing the resolve of men who were already weary from weeks of war. By the fifth day, Patton's forces had surrounded the final German strongpoints. The defenders were depleted, low on ammunition and supplies, yet they continued to resist fiercely. The Americans methodically cleared each building, often at close range, knowing that hesitation could be deadly. The city had become a labyrinth of barricades, rubble, and fire, with every street a gauntlet. Finally, on the sixth day, after nearly a week of relentless combat, American soldiers reached the headquarters of the German general. Exhausted, battered, and outnumbered, the defenders could no longer hold. The general was captured, his defiance finally brought to an end. The battle had claimed countless lives, left the city in ruins, and tested every element of Patton's leadership. It was a stark reminder of the brutality of urban warfare and the high cost of stubborn resistance. The 6 days of combat had forged stories of courage, ingenuity, and endurance. Soldiers remembered the narrow escapes, the tactical brilliance, and the relentless pressure that ultimately broke the German defense. Patton's name was etched into history, not just for victories on open fields, but for leading his men through the terrifying chaos of city streets, where every turn could be lethal and every decision could mean life or death.
After 6 days of relentless combat, Patton's forces finally reached the German general's headquarters. The streets leading to it were still littered with the remnants of battle, burned-out vehicles, shattered windows, and piles of rubble that made every step uncertain. Smoke hung in the air, carrying the scent of gunpowder and fire, and the echoes of artillery still rattled the city's skeletoned buildings.
Soldiers moved cautiously, knowing that even now danger could lurk behind a doorway or in the shadows of a collapsed roof. The Americans entered the building with careful precision. The German general was seated at a sturdy wooden desk, surrounded by a few of his remaining officers. Despite the chaos that had consumed his city, his expression remained calm, almost defiant. He had resisted surrender for nearly a week, confident that his fortified positions and determined troops could hold off Patton's army. Yet the walls around him had fallen, the streets were dominated by the Americans, and the weight of inevitable defeat pressed heavily upon him. Patton arrived shortly afterward, stepping into the room with his trademark presence. He did not need to shout or assert his authority. His reputation preceded him. The general immediately understood the power of the moment. He was facing the man who had orchestrated his defeat, the strategist who had broken his defenses while preserving his own forces. Silence hung in the room, punctuated only by distant artillery, the crackle of fires outside, and the faint sounds of the wounded being carried through the streets. The interaction between the two men was tense and measured. Patton spoke deliberately, emphasizing the futility of further resistance while acknowledging the courage of those who had defended the city. His words carried authority and finality, leaving no room for negotiation or argument. For the German general, it was a moment that would linger in memory, a recognition that defiance had its limits, even for those determined to resist to the last. Outside, American soldiers worked to secure the city. Every street, every building, every corner that had been contested for 6 days was checked and cleared. Fires smoldered in the ruins, rubble blocked alleyways, and the occasional gunshot reminded soldiers that the city had not yet fully fallen silent. Medics moved quickly, tending to wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Residents cautiously began to emerge from their hiding places, surveying a city scarred by combat, yet beginning to feel the presence of order. The German defenders, exhausted and depleted, were processed as prisoners of war. Officers, including the general, were treated according to the conventions of the time, ensuring discipline and adherence to the rules of engagement. Patton's men maintained strict control, balancing victory with responsibility. Every step through the city reminded them of the high cost of stubborn defiance, the human toll of urban warfare, and the precision required to achieve success with minimal additional loss of life. For Patton, the capture was more than a military accomplishment. It was the culmination of days of meticulous planning, bold execution, and relentless pressure. The city had been taken, the German general's defiance ended, and the Americans had proven their ability to conduct complex operations in the most difficult conditions. Yet the victory was tempered by the sights of destruction and the knowledge of lives lost, both soldier and civilian, in streets that had become battlefields. By the time control was fully established, Patton's forces had secured every building and cleared every street. Soldiers walked through the shattered city, aware that each corner held a story of courage, fear, or sacrifice. The German general had been captured, his resistance concluded, and the city, though scarred, was under American control. The aftermath of the 6-day struggle left an indelible mark, a reminder of the brutality of urban combat and the costs of unwavering defiance in the final days of the war. The capture of the general was both a tactical and psychological victory. It demonstrated Patton's ability to lead under extreme conditions, coordinate complex operations, and maintain discipline among his forces. The city, once a stronghold of resistance, now symbolized both the destructive power of war and the effectiveness of strategic planning. For the soldiers and officers involved, it was an experience that would stay with them long after the smoke cleared, a story of determination, leadership, and the high stakes of every decision in the crucible of battle.
The German general sat quietly, the weight of defeat pressing down with a force he had never experienced in all his years of command. Patton, standing before him, did not need to raise his voice. The general already knew the truth. His city was lost, his troops scattered, and his defiance had come to an end. Yet, in that tense moment, Patton spoke with clarity, authority, and a presence that would etch itself into the general's memory forever. Patton's words were simple but precise, a mixture of respect and inevitability. He acknowledged the courage it took to hold a city under siege for 6 days, yet he reminded the general of the futility of resisting a force that had prepared, planned, and executed every step with ruthless precision. There was no triumph in empty bravado, no glory in stubbornness when weighed against strategy, discipline, and the lives of thousands. The German general, who had once challenged the Americans with the words, "Come and take it," now faced the consequences of that defiance in the presence of the very man who had taken it. Outside, the city began to breathe again, though cautiously. Soldiers patrolled the streets, checking barricades, extinguishing fires, and assisting civilians as they emerged from basements and hidden corners. The streets bore the scars of 6 days of intense fighting, cratered buildings, rubble-strewn avenues, shattered windows, and burned vehicles, but order was gradually returning. For many civilians, the arrival of Patton's forces meant the end of fear, if not the end of suffering. The general listened as Patton explained the reasoning behind his approach, the careful orchestration of artillery, tanks, and infantry, and the relentless pressure that had worn down the city's defenses. Every point made the same clear statement. Victory had been earned through skill, coordination, and unyielding determination. The words were not meant to humiliate, but to impress upon him the reality of leadership, the weight of decisions in war, and the consequences when defiance meets strategy. Patton emphasized that even the smallest decisions, how to place a squad, when to advance, when to pause, could mean the difference between life and death, victory and ruin. Patton also recognized the humanity of the moment. He understood that this German general had acted out of duty, honor, and loyalty to his men. Yet loyalty without judgment, courage without strategy, and defiance without foresight could only lead to ruin. In that quiet room, far removed from the echoes of battle, history witnessed an exchange that went beyond victory and defeat. It was a lesson in leadership, responsibility, and the price of stubbornness in war. Back in the city, the soldiers and medics worked tirelessly. Wounded men were carried to field hospitals, civilians were guided to safety, and the devastated streets were slowly organized into a semblance of order. Every building cleared, every barricade dismantled, every street secured reminded the Americans of the high cost they had paid. Lives had been lost, bravery had been tested, and the brutal reality of urban combat had left its mark on all who witnessed it. For the German general, the words of Patton became a memory that lingered far beyond the battle. They were a reminder of the fine line between courage and folly, between defiance and pragmatism. He would recall the precision of the assault, the discipline of the American troops, and the inevitability of the outcome, understanding that resistance without calculation could never withstand skillful leadership and relentless determination. Patton's forces eventually began to withdraw from the immediate ruins, leaving the city in the hands of administrators and medics. But the story of the battle and the words exchanged in that quiet room would resonate long after theirs. Soldiers who had fought in the streets remembered the intensity, the close quarters combat, and the perseverance required to take every block. Civilians remembered the terror, the courage, and the rare moments of mercy amidst chaos. And the captured general carried with him the undeniable lesson of what happens when defiance meets unwavering strategy, a lesson that would remain etched in his mind for decades to come. The 6 days of brutal fighting, the calculated maneuvers, and the final exchange between victor and defeated became emblematic of the closing chapters of the European War. It was a story of leadership, human endurance, and the costs of both courage and stubbornness. Patton had demonstrated decisiveness, foresight, and the ability to inspire both fear and respect. The German general had learned, in the most direct way possible, the power of strategy over defiance. And the city, though scarred and battered, stood as a silent witness to the lessons of one of the most intense and revealing battles of the final months of World War II.